Good afternoon, everyone. We're so excited to be here. I'm honored to be facilitating this book launch. It's my first. And thank you, Gabby, for joining us this early. Thank you, Alex, for joining us today. And first and foremost, I'll introduce myself for anyone who might be joining us and they don't know me. My name is Ruth Nyakirayo. I am an academic facilitator of the RSC-BIA Fellowship at RLRH. And today I'm joined by two amazing authors, and I'll start by introducing Gabby and then introducing Alex, and then I'll share with you all how we're going to structure today's session. So Gabby, who's joining us all the way from Ontario, London, Canada, is an author and has another book coming up, and his writing focuses mainly on refugee stories, which is pinned on his lived experience and representations of exile experiences. His first book, Run Elvin, which you can see there and here too, contains multitudes, and we'll be sharing much about that today. I'll be sharing with you key themes, and we'll be having discussions around that. And then one thing about him that stands out is that he's a founder and a CEO of Liven Books, his own publishing house, I think. And the whole idea of this publishing house is to attract a huge number of refugee and immigrant intellectuals who are writing about displaced people and the historical impacts of the colonial experience in so many countries. Many of these writers, like him, have tried to find traditional and even niche publishers, but it's such a competitive market. And as we learned yesterday, when there's no space, you create your own, and he's a leader in doing that. And we are honored to have you, Gabby. And next to me is Professor Alexander Betts, professor at the Refugee Studies Center. And he'll be joining us today discussing his newly released book, The Wealth of Refugees, How Displaced People Can Build Economies. At this point, I'm just going to hand it over we'll start with Gabby to give us your initial reflections on your book. Especially one question that I'd like you to respond to was, what was the writing process like? What was the driving factor and motivator behind you writing Run Elvin? Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction, Ruth, and Dr. Alexander Bates. Thank you so much for hosting this with me. I'm really honored to do that. I've been a follower of your work since I was a student, and so this is really a very huge privilege for me. It's a very huge honor. I started writing this book in 2018, and the reason why I started doing it is my son was born in 2017, just 1 year when I got in Canada, and then I was depressed about that. I was still very young. I didn't know how to be a father because I've never had one. I grew up with my grandfather. And then also another depressing fact is that my son was born in a refugee camp, in Zareka refugee camp. He still lives there with his mother and my grandparents. And so it really gave me a reason to write, because I was worried what happens, if I don't make it, or what happens if I die any time from now. This boy is just gonna, inherit the entire family's, experiences that I grew up in. So as a way basically to comfort myself and comfort him, or talk to him, in case I'm not there, I started writing a book. And I was inspired by also different kinds of authors who have written letters to their, cousins, to their kids. People like James Baldwin, people like Ta-Nehisi Coates in the USA, and also other kinds of literature. So I started writing from that place.
Thank you so much, Gabby, for sharing that. That's quite deep and poignant. And after listening to Alex, I'm going to give a quick brief overview and my take, and then we get to the discussion. Alex, in your book, you mentioned that it took this is a collection of a decade works of research. Do you mind sharing just a quick overview of the book and the process of writing it also?
Yeah, I'll do a very brief overview, but I also just want to say what an honour it is for me to share this platform with Gabby. I've read his book, and it's outstanding. There are very few books you read that actually feel like they change you when you read them. And I found it to be an extraordinary work that I think everyone should read. It charts a very personal journey, a journey from having been born in Rwanda to living in Tanzania, moving to Malawi and Zeleka refugee camp, describing that, and the aspiration to access education, move on to higher education in Canada. And it does it in a way where the narrative is very powerful, but it picks up on a lot of general, very important themes. The history and legacies of colonialism in Rwanda that led to Gabby's flight, the experiences of moving with hope, and that hope being not realized in moving to Malawi, the challenges of navigating education, getting the resources to get to primary education, secondary education, tertiary education, and the themes in that of the challenges of the camp being things that we can all draw from. But the level of writing, the description involved, the very personal and intimate way in which you discuss it, Gabby, I find your book absolutely remarkable, and I think it's one everyone should read. And so in that context, I genuinely think my book is less interesting, and it's less well written. I think that's key, because Gabby's is for a very general audience. Mine, I aspire to have people read, but the audience is a little bit different. The audience is academics, but also policymakers and practitioners. And really, my starting point, my positionality in Europe, is trying to speak to European politicians, policymakers, international organizations, and shift what they can do within a framework that can be realistic and implementable. But it stems from a deep, long-standing frustration, and here there's a connection to Gabby's work, with the absence of opportunity, very often in camps, and camp-like contexts described as settlements in cities in the East African region. And so I feel very privileged that over a decade I've been able to draw upon not only my work, but the work of colleagues in Oxford and the work of Oxford colleagues in the field, working with us as research assistants, being involved in the data collection of the Refugee Economies Programme, and connect the insights of the Refugee Economies Programme to work that I've done on the politics of refugee rights. So a lot of my own research is focused on the politics that underlies socioeconomic rights. So why is it that we have limitations on socioeconomic rights, the right to work, freedom of movement, the right to own property and start businesses in Kenya, Ethiopia, and even in Uganda, where there's a sort of celebrated self-reliance strategy? What are the limitations of that? But also what's the politics, the very complex and sometimes murky politics underlying that? So my book really tries to ask the question, as we look forwards, what are sustainable refugee policies? And by sustainable, I mean those that meet refugees' rights in terms of protection, durable solutions, assistance, but also can be reconciled with politics globally, nationally, locally. And I ask 4 questions. The first is ethics. What is right? The second is economics. What works to achieve what's right when we look at the evidence? The third is politics. Once we know what's right, once we know what works to achieve what's right, how do we persuade those in power to begin to implement that? And the fourth is around policy. What do we do next to begin to shift this? And I work very much with a framework that I think of as kind of a realist political tradition, saying if we're going to affect real world change, we can't always start from the ideal. We have to start with the limitations of politics, but over time, gradually seek to move that politics through narrative change, through advocacy, through awareness changing, through using data, through storytelling, through giving people platforms on which to speak and present that case. So it tries to be interdisciplinary, and obviously it draws upon insight from 3 countries, Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, in cities and camp-like contexts. And I'll leave it there so we can get back to Gabby's book.
Thank you so much for that, Alex. I feel like Alex has given a whole summary of what his book is, but still I'll share a few of my thoughts, then come to you, Gabby, for a couple of questions that we have prepared for today. And something exciting to us all, we recently started the RLRH book club, and our first book was On Weight of Whispers by a Kenyan author, Yvonne Owor, who looks at a Rwandese refugee who escapes to Kenya, but due to his class, he finds it hard to navigate. And our second book is actually Ran Elvin, and we're honored to be having this discussion as a good entry to the book. So we're not going to spoil so much, but we'll give you something to whet your appetite, right? Okay, so a few compliments from me. I found Gabby's writing quite impeccable. First, the way you address this to your son, and also I really appreciated the style. So it starts as you write a letter to your son, and then you go into history. And I must say his understanding of history is quite nicely and poignantly weaved. I really appreciated the way you point out Rwanda's politics, the Hamitic hypothesis, amongst other things, and you explain it in such a way that anyone can be able to understand and get to know the politics behind displacement and the politics behind the war that led to many individuals fleeing. And then one thing that also stands out is the way that you creating and weaving in history of Tanzania, the asylum policies in Tanzania, the time that they choose to forcefully repatriate, that sounds like oxymoron, force people out of the country, and that's how you end up leaving and escaping towards Malawi. And then one thing that also I must mention is the language. I have highlighted so many things and was like, I like your command of English. Would be keen to hear your thoughts and experiences when you're writing that and what your editing process felt like. But at this point, having asked you, coming back to Alex, well, Alex mentions that the book is written mainly for an academic space and policy. I found the book quite accessible. And I remember sharing with the fellows, we actually went through an article, which I think you had it published as an article looking at patronage politics in Uganda. And one thing that stood out, and you'll be coming back to that as you weave in Gabby's book, is when you talk about how one Idi Amin, who many people would think of repressive asylum policies, actually had policies which contributed to what self-reliance looks like in Uganda right now. But having said that, coming to you, Gabby, the question of memory actually features in your book so much. And at some point, you talk of it transmitting intergenerationally, like some trauma-born genetic mutation. And this stands out, especially when you recounting the experience of, forgive my bad pronunciation, Nsenga. Yeah, who, when you're fleeing towards Malawi, gets visited by his trauma. I particularly like the way you phrase it, visited by his trauma. You sort of make the point that memory of trauma and memory of displacement is such a huge thing that carves the way refugees experience the very mundane in life. Really keen to hear your comments on this, and also really keen to hear, did you specifically work on creating memory to be the center of this? Yeah, and what do you think is the place of memory when it comes to displacement and refugee studies as a whole? So many questions for you, but keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ruth. I'm going to try to tie it to Alex's book, The Wealth of Refugees, and then I'll weave in the memory aspect of it. I think memory is everything, and it's everything basically makes us. It's something that helps us to keep going, to learn from our past mistakes and just basically to keep surviving in life. When it comes to refugee experiences, there are experiences that deeply leave you, how would I say, stranded, or they leave you depressed, even when the refugee experiences ends. Like, for example, in my case, I'm in Canada right now, safe and well protected here. But my memories still go back to Tanzania. They still go back to a refugee camp in Malawi. They even transcend that. They go back to my grandparents, to my mother. They go back to the colonial history that I was never there to experience. So having a refugee basically telling their memories, I think it's such a great experience, and I think this this is the worth of refugees. This is what people like Alexander, who are working in policy, basically take to shape policy. These are the kinds of stories that they basically use to convince politicians. People who are in position to change things. People who are in position to implement, to take actions basically on different kinds of issues that are happening, in different societies. And so I would say that memory is pretty much everything. Going back to the history of displacement in Tanzania, especially when it came to Rwanda, to refugees from Rwanda. Refugees from Rwanda were never accepted in that country because of political reasons. I think some had to do with, Kagame's ties, the president of Rwanda's ties with Tanzania, but also the refugee policy itself in Tanzania, because you understand when refugees are fleeing the country, their home country has the home country is afraid that these refugees are going to attack again their country at a certain point in time. So policymakers in that particular country are aware of that, and basically as a way to keep their diplomatic relations, they are forced to kick out refugees. Just so that they can maintain their relationships with the government now in power. And so I would say that those are the kinds of styles, those are the kinds of experiences that you cannot just push aside and go on. Some refugees, once they have attained, once they have left the camp, once they have gone back to their mother country, or once they have migrated to Europe, or once they have been given a place to settle down in their host country, they tend to forget. But for an academic, or for someone who is writing, for someone who is reading, or for someone who is interested in history, especially their personal histories, it's very tough to forget. And the people you live with, the experiences you go through still takes you back to reconnect with your past. So it never leaves you. I would say the refugee experience never leaves you. You take it with you wherever you go.
Thank you so much for that, Gabi. I could listen to you like all day talking about this, and that's the feeling I got also reading through this. And I'm going to connect this to what Alex brings out in his book, and also keen to hear about Alex's thoughts on like memory and your reflections when you're reading Gabi's book. But before I go to that, you mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is, you mentioned that he was one of the people who motivated you or mentored you in a way when you're writing to your son. And in one of his books, he talks about, it's called The Water Dancer, and talking about the slavery issue in America. He talks about forgetting is like the worst sin that we as a people can do to ourselves, and I wouldn't want to add much to that. So I'm going to take this back to Alex. Keen to hear your thoughts on what you thought reading through and getting the views about memory, and tying that to political history, which comes out in your book. The fact that you went back, I was really impressed when you talk about going to Geneva and actually searching through archives to see what policies looked like. And let's connect this to why is it important for us to know how things were carried out before, in changing how things are going on right now.
Yeah, I think history is very important to understand where we are today. And in Gabi's book, there's a really nice, accessible history of Rwanda, and particularly the colonial legacy in Rwanda, unpacking the legacies of German and Belgian colonialism, but also linking that to the effects, the neo-colonial effects, is the way Gabi frames it, on the Kayibanda and Habyarimana regimes and the subsequent effects. And it was very powerful seeing you look at history to make sense of your own trajectory, and seeing behind all of that the legacies of colonialism. I suppose in my book, what I partly try to do is look back at the history of refugee self-reliance, because it's become, for the UNHCR system, for the Global Compact on Refugees, that the go-to mantra is refugee self-reliance. And we often forget that there is a long history of refugee self-reliance, that policies around self-reliance have been in Uganda since independence in 1962 and even earlier. And that historicization is easy for policymakers and practitioners to misunderstand. They can celebrate Uganda's self-reliance policy, and as I show in the book, there's good reasons to see it positively, giving refugees the right to work, freedom of movement, aspiring to provide plots of land in refugee settlements. Those are really positive things with relatively positive impacts compared to, say, some of the legislative framework that exists in Kenya or has existed in the past in Ethiopia. But to understand the replicability, we need to see the political context behind it. So as you said, it was fascinating for me to kind of identify that this celebrated set of policies in Uganda have a long history and a complicated political past, that Idi Amin, who we think of as having being very problematic from a forced displacement perspective, having persecuted Ugandan Asians, many of whom were resettled in my own country, the UK, and yet it was Amin who very visibly stood and shook hands with the UNHCR representative and was the person who signed Uganda up to the 1951 convention. It was Idi Amin who opened many of the refugee settlements in Uganda that continue to be celebrated. He didn't do it just because of a concern altruistically for refugee rights. He did it partly because he lacked support in Buganda, and for his military, for his cabinet, he relied upon backing from people from what is today South Sudan, from former Zaire and from Rwanda. So the basis of his support, the basis of his ability to maintain the regime was the backing of people from outside the country. And it was really crucial for him to get that support by providing high quality settlements that could be used for military training, for organization to buttress the regime. And the legacies of that obviously can be seen today. So there are parallels between the Amin regime and the current government in Rwanda in terms of many of the sources of support, in terms of the potential political challenge within Buganda, compared with backing that often comes from the hinterlands, the southwest, the Banyankole region, and the northwest Nile Valley region. And so unless we see those historical continuities, we can often celebrate things in the present that are deeply complicated, or political organizations, donor governments can seek to replicate things but not understand the conditions that have enabled them. So it allows us to look critically at things that we might otherwise celebrate unquestioningly, but it also allows us to see that the conditions to replicate things are deeply enmeshed in politics and history. So I'm almost looking at history from a different perspective to Gabby, but a complementary perspective, because in that picture is still the legacies of colonialism and grappling with that. And I can also see the personal dimensions of that coming almost from the opposite side of the legacies of empire. So I grew up in a city called Bristol, and Bristol was a very wealthy city in the period of empire. And so many of the privileges I grew up with in that city were built on the privileges that came from empire. And I was very struck with that. I grew up with a sort of, on the top of a hill in my city is the wealthy area where relatively rich people live, and at the bottom of the hill are where workers used to live who were involved in that economy. So it's really striking for me to think in a global and historical context, as Gabby really articulately explores, the links between colonialism, neoliberalism, and the things that connect intimately experiences in the quote-unquote global south with the decisions and choices made now and historically in the global north.
Thank you so much for that, Alex. I hope you both realize that there's so much that these books, both your books interlink. It's like you were writing on almost similar issues from different perspectives, but still addressing like the center issue which brings us up here today. Thank you for that, Alex. Well, back to you, Gabby. So another theme that stands out in your book is the question of war, the question of single parent households, and also displacement. And spoiler for those who are yet to read, but Gabby talks about living with a mom, and talking about you talk about your mom finding escape and solace in marriage. So that's how you end up in Burundi with your stepdad. And then a couple of things that come out from that is there's this time you're playing with other kids and they're chanting in Kirundi, they're chanting in Kirundi, and I wish I could be able to speak Kinyarwanda. Sorry, I wish I'd be able to speak Kirundi so as to be able to paint out what exactly Gabby says. So I'm going to hand this over to you, Gabby, but it's really keen to hear, when you're writing this, from your own experience, how does displacement look like? And like, to a child's mind, what does asylum look like? Because one thing that comes out clearly is you want your son to be able to understand what that looked like. You don't want this to be lost to him. Does that make sense? Over to you.
Yes, I think it does. It does so much. I would say any person in displacement wants to live a normal life like everybody else. They want to be self-reliant. They want to stand on their own. They need an opportunity basically to get ahead in life. But policies, refugee policies, make it harder. For example, in the case of Malawi, where refugees are not allowed to work or officially in any government position or with any other institutions. At first, when I was a student in secondary school, we actually had a strike whereby we were supporting our teachers who were removed from salaries, and then they were being paid basically stipend in forms of what? In forms of 15 kilograms of rice and 2 liters of oil, as opposed to money that they were being paid as a salary, right? So that affected basically their financials. It affected their financial situation. But refugees are very creative people, And one thing that I always try to in the book, what I try to do with my son is basically to tell him through my experiences how I navigated those experiences. Now, I never grew up with my father, I never grew up with my mother, and I haven't met her ever since I left Tanzania 2002, and it's been 20 years now. She lives in Burundi. But I was able basically to work on my own with the help of my grandparents who would basically go to a farm. They were farmers. They earned a living by farming. They didn't have a land in Malawi, but there was a way to communicate with Malawians. And I think many refugees still do right now. So whereby you lose a land, you lose a land from Malawians, and then you use that land basically to farm your crops and all that. And after the season is done, you give the land back. So that is one way of earning a living. As what I'm trying to do with my son is basically to walk him through my steps, just so that he can survive on his own. If it so happens that he grows up in a refugee camp and I'm not there to protect him, right? I just want to touch a little bit also on the history of refugee self-reliance in Africa, as Alexander Bates has already said. It has a very long history since after independence, after colonialism. The model was that these European countries did not want to engage with African refugees or refugees from elsewhere, and so what they would basically do was that, okay, we are going to give you money. We'll give you money in forms of aid, just so that you can be able basically to take care of refugees within your areas, within your country, within the boundaries of your country. And what most government did at this time was basically to use that money for their own, developmental project, understanding that they are just coming right out of colonialism, right? And they had so many things to catch up with. They didn't have enough funds, but that continued, right? and it still continues right now. It's not something that, supporting refugee self-reliance is not something that started yesterday. It's not something that started, a few years ago. It's something that has a very, very deep history. But we need to see that when countries or when governments are supporting self-reliance, the refugees or even the citizens don't really know what that looks like. They think like it's the government that is using its own resources basically to support refugees, but actually those resources are coming from the outside the country. Now, when they reach into that country, the government can basically do anything. So, with me, I think where I differ with Alexander Bates, and he knows that we've talked about that, is it's a business model, right? Like the refugee system, the refugee protection system is basically a business model set up to protect interests of governments, to protect the borders. The refugee has totally nothing to gain outside of that. If anything, the refugee are just an inconvenience. But now, that inconvenience is very tough to get rid of. And so, how do you take care of that situation, So you have to find a way to engage them. You have to find a way to support them in one way or another. And one program that they bring in is to promote their self-reliance and sell that kind of story in a way that is going to be bought or be accepted by the public. But in reality, that does really not happen. I would say for the government for example, the government of Malawi that signed the CRRIF, the Complementary Refugee Response Framework, they did that because of the cash that they were promised basically to get. It happened before in the 1970s. It is also going to happen now, and it will also happen in the future. So, as Alexander said, that in 2050, we will have so many refugees. People are displaced because of climate issues. People are displaced because of conflicts and all those sorts of problems. Now, my question is always, how is the continent going to deal with this problem, right? How is the continent going to deal with this crisis if they don't find an alternative way of engaging with humans outside the economy, overlooking the potential, the economic potential that the country or the refugee is going to bring in, because it's only very few people who are given that opportunity to contribute economically. It's not the vast majority of the refugees.
Thanks so much for that, Gabby, and also for preempting the next questions that was good to go to. Just taking this to you, Alex, and building on the critique that Gabby...
I cannot hear you, right?
Oh, you can't hear me? Yes?
Is the microphone?
Oh, it's red. I think the batteries are almost... Okay, can you hear me now? Still not yet. And now?
No, I cannot hear you.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Just...
Can you hear me, Gabby?
No, you can't hear me.
No.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
As you're waiting for this to be fixed, I wanted to bring in the fact that you talk about full inclusion of refugees when it comes to...
I still can't hear you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, maybe someone should send him a text and tell him we're going to be coming. Yeah, or should we wait?
No, go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay, yeah. You talk about full inclusion of refugees when it comes to refugee self-reliance. Do you mind shedding more light and building on what Gabby was talking about?
Yeah, I agree very much with the analysis that Gabby's just offered, that in a way self-reliance, for all the hope, is based on a challenging political deal between donor communities, host governments, and people in authority at the local level. And that's the sort of politics that I try to describe, a politics that, like Gabby, I think of as disingenuous, that it works very much for the donors. Self-reliance is a compromise that enables people to be a little bit more comfortable in camp contexts, make camp contexts a little bit more legitimate, but while avoiding onward movement to Europe and rich countries. And that politics is the reality, and I agree with that critical analysis, and it's something that I try to articulate in the book as well. We also see that self-reliance programs, often labelled for self-reliance, don't achieve any meaningful self-reliance. So if we think about the Calabaye settlement, opened obviously next to Kakuma in 2016. One of the things we did was look at the experiences of newly arrived South Sudanese refugees coming into Calabaye and compared them with newly arrived South Sudanese arriving in Kakuma. And in many ways, there wasn't much difference in the outcomes 2 years later. So Calabaye had been set up with this idea of market-based opportunities, with this idea of more integration between the Turkana host community and the refugee population, opportunities for cash-based assistance instead of in-kind food assistance. And yet, when we looked at those outcomes, they weren't very different. When we looked 2 years later, only 2% of South Sudanese newly arrived refugees described themselves as living independently of aid, which is UNHCR's definition of self-reliance. Only 6% had independent income-generating sources. So a lot of those self-reliance programs are circulating aid money slightly differently, but they're not actually building the economies of remote areas in a way that can lead to meaningful growth in business opportunity, meaningful job creation. And so I very much agree with Gabby that we need to do something different. So I'm really struck by Gabby's highlighting that he really couldn't be satisfied in that refugee camp model, and rightly so. He writes on going to Canada, although I had not achieved great success in the monetary sense, I believe my passion and progress showed them I would not settle with a life not well lived. I would not go hungry, I would not sell my soul, and I would not remain within the refugee camp to live out the remaining days of my life. But Gabby also highlights the challenge of what do we have to do with rising numbers of displaced people to ensure that the majority share in those opportunities? Because realistically, not everyone is going to get a scholarship to go to Canada. That's going to be reserved for a relative few, and we hope that number will expand and we can work collectively to expand that number. But we've got to aspire for something better, more meaningful, more dignified, with far greater opportunity in those regions in which the majority of the world's refugees are hosted. And so that needs to go beyond the camp. It needs to reimagine the camp. It needs serious, significant investment in building at a macroeconomic level the regions that host refugees, creating opportunities for integration in urban areas so that refugees are not left subsisting on the informal economy at the periphery of having economic rights, job opportunities, where they can be meaningful social mobility. So I very much share Gabby's analysis and think that that's the project. How do we reimagine how refugees can live on the continent in ways that create opportunities while simultaneously opening up the kind of opportunities that Gabby has experienced to as many people as possible.
Thanks so much for that, Alex. And reminds me of quotes that you of a couple of sentences that you make towards the end when you're talking about that self-reliance has to be situated within what might be crudely described as big economics and big politics. I also loved how you said it's much about macroeconomic issues as microeconomic issues. And then you come in and say, put simply, there can be no refugee self-reliance without seismic advance in the refugee system's ability to engage with economics and politics. While still holding to these thoughts, and it's a question I'll ask also when Gabby were able to communicate. Gabby paints towards his access to finally leaving for Canada, he paints how the challenges that he faces with raising even almost less than a couple of cents to be able to pay for examinations, the fact that he has to get uniform from clothes from uncles and stuff like that, has to do menial jobs to raise funds. And this got me thinking, this probably, it's a couple of years past, but this at the same place where we're talking about self-reliance. And one question that was coming to my mind, what does self-reliance look like then in such a space? Can self-reliance actually happen in a non-enabling environment? I'm going to pause there to just, but that just shows you how this feels like just a jumble in my head, trying to connect the pieces and seeing how, okay, self-reliance makes sense, but then it's not making sense. But then it seems like there's hope here, but then there isn't here.
I mean, the self-reliance language suits the agendas of a lot of powerful people. It suits the agendas of northern states because it implies they're moving beyond encampment but legitimates a lot of that model. It suits many host countries because it gives them access to development aid from the north and a degree of legitimacy. It suits UNHCR partly because part of the history of UNHCR's connection to self-reliance is that for mandate reasons they've not been able to talk about development, they've not been able to talk about economics. These are under the mandate of UNDP, of the World Bank. So they needed a sort of a light, fairly anemic language to engage with those huge questions of development. And so self-reliance played that role. Now, when I say this needs to be seen in the context of big politics and big economics, we need to understand that what shapes these opportunities is questions that really matter for governments, questions of security, international development, migration. But too often, the residual leftover consequences of those big decisions are what end up governing the lives of displaced people. And in terms of the economics, we use language like self-reliance, which is about small microeconomic interventions. Can we have a livelihoods program here? Can we have a tailoring program or a beekeeping program or a kitchen garden program? When actually what we need to make a difference is large-scale job creation for refugees and hosts. It's infrastructure, it's roads, it's electricity, it's running water. And the scale of investment required to achieve that is way beyond the level that most donor governments are prepared to acknowledge. The levels of innovation needed in finance to mobilize that money is much more serious than is being recognized. And so there are little indicators of a desire to go in that direction. So the county government of Turkana went some way towards that possibility to reinvent, and yet the self-reliance programs in and around Calabaye have actually been quite limited. So it needs that mindset shift in creating economic opportunity in the regions that host refugees. And perhaps we need to sort of talk less about self-reliance and talk more about socioeconomic rights and talk more about economic opportunity. Let's use the language that is impactful, describe it for what it is, rather than use this slightly soft, politically convenient language of self-reliance. And that's not to say there aren't good intentions in the self-reliance agenda. That's not to say that self-reliance isn't far better than encampment, but it's to say, actually, as Gabby alludes to, what can we do to reimagine something quite different from that?
Thank you, Alex. I don't know that Gabby is back. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Oh, so glad. Okay, so I'm going to ask one of the final questions, then open up for questions and any comments that that our audience might be having. So going back to your story again, you mentioned of this teacher who was quite young, and he ended up getting a scholarship through WUSC, and goes to Canada. And you talk about going to the airport and seeing him off. And one question that came up, I know it sounds unrelated, but one question that came up in my mind, how often do individuals go back to the spaces where they came from, go back to the camp? You talk about this teacher really influencing you, really impacting you, and also talk of a teacher who used to call you, say that, you are like my children, and how that changed a lot. So I got myself thinking, and this is to everyone who's joining us and probably has might have lived in a camp or might have been in a similar space of displacement. what do we do to go back to be impactful to those who are there? And I'm not trying to insinuate that it's a must that you go back, but if this was the influence, what do you think the influence of us going back and even through, and going back might be in different ways, as we learned from Bahat yesterday, it could be even through our YouTube channels. Yes, really keen to hear your thoughts on that, and also you feel free to reflect on what Alex just talked about. And sorry, and also I acknowledge. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you, but I didn't not get the question.
Oh, okay, yeah, I know it was quite winded. You talk about this teacher who's quite impactful, and he lives for Canada. But one question that came up to my mind is, how often, and I know probably it's not possible to go back to the country, but you mentioned towards the end you go back to Malawi for a conference. How possible is it for us to go back to these spaces where that somehow were quite challenging, but also molded us to be able to give, to be able to show others that this pathway is possible also?
Yeah, so when I went back to Malawi, I was in 2019. I went there as a student researcher. I was working with RISC, on a project that basically sought to understand, youth refugee self-reliance. And so it was all in this wake of, the complementary refugee response framework and how that was going to be implemented in Malawi, in the country, basically to promote the welfare of the young people in the camp. And so for me, I went there as both a refugee, as an insider and an outsider. As an insider in the sense that I've been there, I knew the spaces. I was happy to see my family, but also sad to see my family in the situation. But it was also really very important to go there as a different person, to kind of relive those experiences again. I dedicated chapter 13 basically to tell what that experience meant and how it was like. I'm explaining this again to my son, because it is then that I met him for the first time, in 2019. He was 2 years old by that time. So it was sort of relieving, right? Because I'm coming from totally different circumstances to another different life that I had left behind, a few years ago. So I would say that it was an experience, really. It was quite an experience. But again, it still lives with me because that family is still there, and I'm in Canada, doing all the best I can to support them to become self-reliant themselves. And so it's a pleasure to be in Canada, to be here and support family back home.
Can I come in? Yeah, reading the book from the perspective of a university academic and a university administrator, there was so much insight for how we think about education and the role of higher education in the lives of refugees and displaced people. I was really struck as well by the key turning points, the role of mentors offering wise words. So when you met Mr. Moyo, your old teacher, and he said to you, if you don't mind, he said, he said to you, what were you doing seated at the bar, especially at that hour of the evening? And he said to you, Gabby, you're a good student. Whatever reason you have to watch music at the bar can never be strong enough to convince me otherwise. I want to see you make it to secondary school and become successful thereafter. And there aren't many sort of figures in the book that you identify by name, but the people you identify are teachers and professors who came to you at key moments and said, actually, you've got potential, you have something that you can offer beyond where you are now, and it's that seemed to change your perspective. And so you also describe the huge amount of struggle around that, and it's those messages that I think sort of stick with me and make me think that actually there are roles that universities in particular have to reach out, to create opportunities, and just offer people a source of inspiration that it wasn't Mr. Moyo or Mr. Masago who did the hard work. It was you, Gabby, who did the hard work. But actually those little nudges, those little bits of recognition were the ones that made a difference. So those are some of the themes that really stayed with me and that I took quite personally as someone sitting in a university.
Yes, Mr. Moyo was very, very impactful, and not only him, but also other teachers who have taught me along the way. I credit so much of my successes to them because we always look upon people who can basically motivate you to do something that you would otherwise have never have thought about. And so teachers are really good at that, and also institutions of higher learning, universities. They shape young refugees' experience in a totally different way. I wouldn't be able to write the book if I never had a chance to go to a university, because that's where I received so much help, so much editing, and so much courage just basically to keep the writing going. This book and the other books that are coming in the near future.
Well, thank you so much, Gabby. Thank you so much, Alex. We're going to take a pause on that and turn to the audience for any questions. And while at it, I must mention again, we will be having the book club meeting, and it will be communicated, and probably it's going to be online so that Gabby can also join us. It will be great. I already spoke to him and he's happy to join us. And yes, anyone with questions? I've seen a couple of questions coming through Zoom. Yes, but let's start with Dominic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I have an observation to make. One to Gabby, and another observation come question to Prof. Now to Gabby first, I think his story runs deep, and it communicates a lot, and which, as Prof put it, the target group, it resonates really well. What caught my attention is the timing of the story. Gabby says that he started when his son was born. And I look at the title. I've not had a chance to read the book. But then I'm curious to ask Gabby a question. What if this son had not been born? And so what is the role of this young man who came forth as your son? Because I think in your presentation, he is inspired, looking at the young man and where he is, where the son is and where he is. It really elicits a lot and drives him to write. So I think I'll give him time to respond. Then to Alexander, I've not also read the book, but I'm curious to read the book. Gabby mentions a model back in Malawi where refugees are allowed to get land, you lease, you work, you farm, and when the tenure is out, you give it back as an economic empowerment model. And I come to you, Prof. What are some of the challenges as you look at the political, social, and policy issues in your book? Do you think the role of climate and at the same time the economic status of countries contribute to be bottlenecks into sustaining or improving the lives of refugees? I have this in mind about our refugee settlements in Kenya. I look at Dadaab, the climate. I look at Kakuma, the climate that I have seen there because I've happened to stay there. The new model Karubei, which still has the same climatic condition, and generally the African countries, their economic status. Do they really influence on their policy actions? Thank you.
Thanks so much. We're going to respond to that and then come to Tom. Gabi, do you want to go first?
I would say that overall, the entire thing was basically to motivate my son to write his experiences, just so that he can understand them. Right now, he turned 5 years old, on May 10th, this week, and he's in a position to see things. He's in a position to start understanding his experiences. And I tie back to when I left my mother. I left my mother when I was 18 years old, right, in Tanzania in 2002. And those experiences that I talk about are the things that I saw. The things that I saw in the refugee camp and the things that I heard people in my society talking about. But then as I grew up, I understand them much more better because of the education. The secondary school education was not enough. I had to be at the university to understand them better and then to engage with them. So it's basically the entire book is basically motivating my son to keep track of his experiences, to see things, to allow himself to experience things, but also to take note of them, to write about them, just so that he can get them, outside of his head. And I'm also encouraging him to become creative in his own way, and in whatever way that means to him, right? So it's the entire process basically of making a man out of him at a very young age, if that is allowed.
Yeah, and it's incredibly powerful, Gabi, what you describe of writing for your son, but having never had the experience of a relationship with your biological father. And I think it allows you to have a voice of imparting wisdom that's more widely relevant and applicable, almost sort of handing on that wisdom to another generation, but addressing someone specific whom you have in mind, your son. And I found sort of, as a father and also as someone who grew up without my father, I could kind of relate to that on a very human level, that it transcended context and culture, and I think draws readers in a way that they can really relate to. So I found that very powerful. Dominic, I think your question is a really interesting one. Are host government policies shaped by climate and also the economic conditions in remote border regions? And absolutely. So both Garissa County and Turkana County are arid, remote, lack infrastructure. It's not a coincidence that those are the areas where camps have been set up. They're near the borders, but why are they near the borders? Partly because that's where the humanitarian response was set up in the early 1990s, and you can, as an international community, support that on the pretense that it's temporary. But of course, everyone knows that what is temporary quickly becomes semi-permanent and endures decade after decade. It's convenient for governments, it's convenient for the international community, for those spaces to be distant, remote, in areas which are otherwise not used economically. People can be forgotten about and excluded through the encampment model. But it poses limitations as well. So some of our research has looked at access to agriculture. So the example you highlight from Gabi's book of giving access to land, that can make a difference. So we did work in Uganda on the effects of distributing access to land in settlements like Nachivali and Changwali. And we found that those who had access to a plot of land did better. They had better food security outcomes, for instance. They had more diverse diets because they were able to grow their food. But it was also a deeply imperfect system. So settlements like Nachivali quickly ran out of land, and so actually a lot of new arrivals didn't get land, or if they did get land, they got half the size of the previous group of arrivals' land, or people had to slice up their land. And as the quality of land and quantity of land became reduced, as the numbers of refugees in the settlements rose, it became less effective. But the model of accessing land for agriculture is one that can have significant benefits. It enables people to have a degree of self-reliance, and it seems to improve outcomes. Now, they've tried elements of agriculture even in remote rural locations. So the so-called kitchen gardens that they've developed in Calabaye and tried to gradually introduce in Kakuma also seem to have some positive effects. They can allow people to access more diverse diets and better food security. but they're very small effects relatively, and it takes huge sort of innovation to create viable dry land agriculture. And so it sort of works for people to talk about technologies like hydroponics. But actually the very need to use those technological solutions to innovate comes from the geographical choices about where refugees are located in the first place. And so I think then from a kind of a big picture perspective, there's a question we might ask ourselves about, should the strategy be to take those regions, which are often neglected, deprioritized by central governments, and make them better? See this as a chance to create borderlands that have access to infrastructure that can be viable economies for host communities, citizens, and displaced populations, and allow people to settle and integrate and overcome encampment. And is that a politically realistic place to start, given that that area is less valued by governments and could be transformed with significant benefits? Or do we need to step back and think again and say, nobody should be compelled to make a life in these areas. It's extraordinarily difficult to make a life. However good you imagined Kakuma or Dadaab to be, it is remote, it is arid, it is inhospitable. The places and spaces where you can make a meaningful and dignified life are not these. And I guess that's a very interesting question about politically, is it realistic to imagine a negotiation with these governments to say, actually, Kenyan government, if you want to close these camps, let's see it as an opportunity to build better integrated settlements in more auspicious parts of your country? Or is it a case of the position of those in power saying, okay, these areas, as the governor of those areas, both areas have acknowledged, face real limitations in attracting investment. Can the presence of refugees be the opportunity for those entire regions to transform with that investment? And so those are very different paths, but I think they're questions that are raised by your point.
So much.
Thank you, Alex and Gabby. I'm going to read 2 questions, and then one question, then go to Tom. And I'm aware we're 5 minutes over time, so I don't know how we're doing. Could you get 5 minutes extra? Please. Okay. I'm Ricardo, a PhD student, and since the early 2000s, Uganda has been practicing self-reliance model for refugees. Refugees continue to receive aid and other support despite the self-reliance model. On the other hand, however, there has been a semblance to community development and empowerment, instead not exactly refugees becoming self-reliant. Can one therefore argue that it's very difficult to achieve self-reliance, but instead achieve refugee integration and community development? And then Tom.
Oh, you want me to ask the question?
Ask your question, then we'll handle the 2.
Thank you, Professor Alexander, and thank you, Gabriel Ndayishimiye, for having this. And for those of us who are experiencing RL, RH, and BIEA as students and researchers, we are actually seeing the vision taking place and taking root in exposing us and bringing us together with professors and writers who are sharing their lived experiences. Now, having said that, lived experiences, Professor, do you see a pattern between regime changes, political changes, and kingdom changes vis-a-vis migration, especially in case of Rwanda and Uganda? Have you seen, have you written something on Buganda Kingdom receiving, for instance, who are they? I don't want to use the term Hutu, and because I don't want to feel as if I don't understand it, but the Rwandans who were described as Tutsi and Hutu, who came to Uganda like in the 1930s, following the Mwami wa Rwanda, the king, who was deposed by Gregory Kaibanda. Do you see that pattern? Also, statelessness. Have you maybe experienced any like writing or research among the Shona in Kenya who eventually became, were provided identity cards and now they are Kenyans. But do you see a pattern in change in Rhodesia to Zimbabwe? Is there some link that also is embedded in forced migration? And Gabriel, thank you for writing that book, and thank you for making it possible for us to access a kind of story, because we want to use stories to tell, other people, to empower them to be able first to find therapy through books, and then two, for us to be able to tell stories, because sometimes we may run out of stories and then we start using up your books. Professor and Gabriel, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. We'll handle that. And then, yes, who would you like to start? Or Gabi?
Yes, I just wanted to briefly touch on self-reliance vis-a-vis integration. I think for me, integration sounds pretty good, because you remember Rwandan refugees who are settled in Uganda. They were integrated in that society for a number of years until when Rwandans decided basically to return to their country on their will. But integration also has issues, because over time resentments with the locals builds up. But it builds up because of the failure of the government. It builds up because of the failure of the leadership. But it's still a very good option as opposed to self-reliance, because the fear with empowering refugees to become self-reliant in this day are the fears that refugees at a certain point basically are going to be in much more economic positions to go back to their home country through different kind of means, and that would include invading the country, because over time, over a period of 30 years or 28 years or something years, they become economically empowered and they are in a position basically to invade their home country just so that they can go back still to their country. Now, what governments basically, in my thinking, have been able to do is to build a contract within themselves to make that impossible. And that is why the integration these days is no longer talked about, is no longer an option served on the table, because of those problems that happen before in the past. I'll give an example of the Rwandan government, just very, very fast, because it knows how it invaded the country. It knows their experiences in Uganda, right? And it has made it very, very difficult for Rwandans to live elsewhere and to live outside of that country. I'm talking about Rwandans who are refugees, because it knows at a certain point in time, they'll take that opportunity to organize themselves and then go back. So it created contracts with other governments just to make refugees' lives miserable. And that does not happen to one government, it happens to so many governments. But integration is still better.
Let me maybe start with Ricardo's question, then come to Tom's. I completely agree that the shift needs to be away from a language of self-reliance to one of something like community development. It makes a lot more sense to talk in terms of this is about development, it's not about self-reliance. I like the mention of community there because it implies it's not just about refugees, but it's also about the host community. It's a move from encampment towards gradual integration and creating settlements in the broad sense, not settlements in the sort of camp plus vision, but integrated spaces, new cities if necessary, building on existing cities, transforming them in ways where the community participates, but where you have the investment to make them viable spaces where displaced populations can live alongside host communities and everyone can benefit. So I see that shift in language as a useful part of the change. So I think I very much buy the logic. The sort of missing piece of this, the elephant in the room, if you like, is kind of citizenship, access to effective membership, overcoming the fiction that refugee populations are temporary and that everyone will ultimately repatriate and go home. Because even if we can imagine notionally that there might be, and this starts to touch on Tom's question, a regime change that allows people to go home, well, people build social ties, they build lives. Going back can be particularly challenging. Even if it's in 15 years, 20 years, you need to enable people to move on with their lives. And so I think there's more discussion taking place about pathways to citizenship and effective membership and participation in the political community of a society. So Colombia recently, with 1.7 million Venezuelans, offered, if you like, a kind of temporary citizenship, which provides effectively citizenship rights to Venezuelans until they can go home. So equal access to health and education facilities, equal access to participation in the society, freedom of movement, the right to remain. And so I think we need to be more creative in saying, actually, are there ways in which we can open up that conversation, even if it's sort of pathways to citizenship and things that might even be emulating sort of Colombia's model. Tom, I think kind of the history of this region, Great Lakes, displacement in Southern Africa, is shaped often by regime change. Regime change shapes the opportunities for repatriation, it shapes new cycles of displacement, and it shapes the policies of host countries, which are often driven by bilateral relationships with neighbours. So I think Gabby in his book charts historically the moments of 1957, 1973, 1994 in the Rwandan case. The shift that takes place with the many of the exiles who moved to Uganda in 1973 moving back in the movement that precipitates or precedes the genocide with Kagame transforms the populations within the settlements in southwest Uganda. It transforms who is welcome in Rwanda and who is not. That changes dramatically with the shift from Habyarimana to Kagame. It changes the dynamics of exile politics. Who needs to mobilize outside the state in order to challenge the politics of authoritarian or semi-authoritarian governments? So Rwandan opposition politics takes place outside the state. Rwandan opposition politics took place largely outside the state under Habyarimana, often with the backing of neighbouring countries. You can see similar dynamics in Sudan in the 1970s and 80s. The relationship between Idi Amin and Nimyeri in Sudan, the relationship then of Obote with that regime, it changed. So from Amin to Obote, the relationships with the neighbouring countries change because their alliance structures are completely different. And the bilateral relationship with the neighbouring country of friend or enemy shapes the policies towards settlements and camps, because those settlement camps and camps at those moments are either seen as supporters of the host country or potential opposition, potential non-state armed actors that could challenge either the host state or the country across the border. And so those dynamics are shaped at these moments of rupture where a regime shift, or I think you very interestingly add the kind of shifts in power within kingdoms and structures of traditional authority, such as in Buganda, the links of those authority structures, which, say in the Ugandan case, are strong under Obote, but weak in the Buganda case under Amin and Museveni, very much change the dynamics about how displacement is thought about and the policies that exist. And I think there's moments of that in the post-colonial period and the struggles for independence, where liberation movements create forms of displacement, new state formation, the shift from Rhodesia to Zambia, Zimbabwe, that creates needs for people to move into exile. So under UDI and Ian Smith in southern Rhodesia, opposition movements go into exile. ZANU-PF is operating in exile. ANC for long periods is operating in exile in those neighbouring countries until there's a regime shift in South Africa. So you can trace those dynamics across the continent, and they're really present in the history in interesting ways. But ways I think perhaps that could be teased out with additional research. So I haven't seen good research which connects state formation, regime change, and shifts in traditional authority structures, and asked how those have shaped cycles of displacement and policies of welcome or exclusion of groups of refugees. And then, of course, the history of all of that is refugees as political actors with agency to change those regimes. So many of the most influential governments have been in exile for periods, and they've shaped their agendas, they've mobilized opposition in exile. And I think that there's two sides to that. There's one of sort of, not necessarily advocating for non-state armed actors, but recognizing there's a long history of refugee engagement in politics, of having the agency to shape politics. And there is a history of refugees and exiles being the next political leaders in states across the continent.
Thank you so much, Tom, for the question. Thank you so much, Ricardo, for the question. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Gabby. Once again, I'll be the terrible facilitator and not take your questions because we're way past time. I've noted 4 people who asked questions. I'm sorry, terribly sorry. Please join us for our book club, and we'll try respond to this. Don't take it personal. At this point, I'm going to hand it over back to Gabby and Alex for parting shots in as few words as possible.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Ruth, for the invitation, and thank you so much, Alexander, for having the conversation with me. I hope at some point we can, continue the conversation in person. But it's what it is, thanks to Zoom. And also, thank you so much for everyone who turned up today. If you have questions about my book, just feel free to message me. Ask if you can share it with you my email. I'll be very happy to discuss with you. Now, if you are also a writer, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be very happy to offer you the kinds of help that I received until the publication of my book. I'll give it back to you, Ruth.
Just to say massive thanks, Gabby, for the conversation, and to Ruth for the excellent moderating. I think one thing that's been really exciting for me is to see the conversation between the books. Books written in quite different ways and quite different styles, but exploring common themes and common threads. And I've really enjoyed seeing how successfully you can combine accounts of lived experience with really thoughtful insights as a researcher and a public intellectual. And I think it's that combination of lived experience with the academic mind you've got, with the public intellectual that you are, that makes this book a real triumph, and I think an inspiration for a lot of people, including me.
And massive appreciation from me. I'm an aspiring writer who just journals, doesn't write publicly. And it's been an honor being able to have this conversation with both of you. And this book can be found, if you have Kindle, can buy it through Kindle, can get it on Amazon. And we have copies for the library. And also Alex's book, you can find it in our library. We have a couple of copies. And I would highly recommend these books. And I'll be communicating with all of us the date of our book club. Thank you very much.